Hey friends, welcome to story time. I am hopping on just a little bit late today because I could not find my Kindle, believe it or not. So forgot that I had been reading last night before I went to bed. But we are in chapter 4 of our book today. We're just chugging right through. And I am so excited to read with you guys. Today, where is chapter 4? If you missed it yesterday, I admitted that I have been reading ahead in our book because I'm just absolutely loving our series that we're going through right now. We're going through a series called The Sisters Grimm, and it's a nice little spin-off of our Grimm, the Brothers Grimm. So they are actually the great-great-great-great-granddaughters of the Brothers Grimm, and they solve mysteries having to do with ever afters, which are fairy tale creatures. So it's super fun, super whimsical, but I think it's great. This particular series is aimed at students who are 3rd through 7th grade. And so if you know anybody who is in that range or would just really enjoy reading with us, feel free to share this video with them so that they can join us during the weekdays for some reading time. So I don't know if this counts for any sort of summer reading that the students might have to do for school, but hey, if it does, awesome. So all right, we are going to get started because I'm already just running a little bit behind with chapter 4. So here is our illustration for today. If you can see it, it looks like a big old giant. All right. "Leave my grandmother alone," Daphne commanded. Before Sabrina could stop her, the little girl rushed forward and kicked the dumpy man in the shin. He cried out in pain and rubbed his leg. Mrs. Grimm then hit him on the top of his head with her heavy book-filled handbag. He crumpled to the ground. Seeing how easily their leader had fallen to a little girl and an old lady, the other 2 thugs laughed. "What are you laughing at?" the leader snapped as he crawled to his feet. "Sorry, Tony. We didn't mean to laugh," one of the goons said. "What are you doing?" Tony bellowed. "What?" the tall one asked defensively. "You told her my name. We all agreed that we were going to keep our identity secret." The tall one shrugged. "Sorry, Tony, I didn't think." "Steve, you just did it again," the other thug pointed out. "You did it too," Tony shouted. "You just told him Steve's name." "Who cares?" Steve said. "Because they can identify us to the cops," Tony complained as he turned his attention back to Mrs. Grimm. He raised his heavy crowbar above his head and snarled, "Now we have to kill him." "Easier said than done," a voice said from behind them. Sabrina and Daphne turned to see Mr. Canis emerge from the shadows with Elvis close behind. "Look out! Here comes her boyfriend," Steve laughed. "You want me to handle him, Bobby?" "Shut up, both of you!" Tony shouted. Why don't you idiots just give them our addresses and phone numbers too?" "If you run off now, no one will get hurt," Canis offered. His voice was powerful and hard, but the thugs just chuckled. Even Sabrina could tell that frail old Mr. Canis wasn't going to be able to stop them. Sometimes he looked as if his own clothes were too heavy for him to wear. Sabrina realized now would be a great time to grab her sister and make their escape, but it didn't feel right. The old woman and her feeble friend needed their help. She would have to do something herself, find a weapon, a rock, a stick, anything that she could use to fight the men off. But the pathway was as clean of debris as was people. Girls, get behind Elvis, please, Mr. Canis said, taking their hands and pulling them back so that the Great Dane was between them and trouble. Enough of this. Get 'em! Tony ordered, and Bobby and Steve lunged at Mr. Canis. Sabrina was sure that they had seen the last of the old man, but he caught both of the men by the throat, one in each hand, and lifted them off the ground, holding them aloft as their feet dangled and kicked. Even more shocking was the loud guttural growl the old man released when he tossed the two thugs, sending them sprawling across the cold concrete ground. For 10 yards they thumped and bounced, groaning with each painful smack against the pavement. All right, if that's the way you want to play it, Tony threatened as he pushed Mrs. Grimm roughly to the ground. He swung his iron bar wildly at Mr. Canis and rushed forward, but the old man quickly stepped sideways and tripped him, sending the thug to the pavement with his friends. Tony leaped up and rushed at Mr. Canis again, only to feel the same painful results. Hurry, girls, we should get to safety, Mrs. Grimm said, as she got up and led them away from the fight. Elvis trotted alongside them, barking warnings at the goons not to follow. When they got to the car, Daphne climbed in, but anxiously peered out the windows. After several minutes, Mr. Canis had still not joined them. We shouldn't have left him. There were 3 of them, Granny. He can't fight them all, the little girl said, with tears running down her cheeks. Before Mrs. Grimm could calm her down, the car door opened, and Mr. Canis crawled behind the wheel. He was completely unharmed, and oddly, he had a little grin on his face. See, Lieblings, he's just fine, the old woman said. She turned to Mr. Canis. The girls were worried about you. The old man turned in his seat and looked back at Sabrina and Daphne. He was his same painfully thin, watery-eyed old self. Daphne leaned forward and planted a kiss on his cheek. His face turned red with embarrassment. Don't you ever do that again, she commanded as she hugged him tightly and then sat back into her seat. Mr. Canis nodded in agreement. I, for one, am thrilled at what's transpiring, Mrs. Grimm said, taking out her notepad and pen. She began jotting notes frantically. Sabrina was shocked. Thrilled? We were almost killed! Killed? Oh, Mr. Canis, doesn't she remind you of Basil? Mrs. Grimm tittered. Mr. Canis nodded. No, I think we have cause to celebrate, the old woman continued. What, did you find a clue? Daphne asked. No, not at all. Then what's to celebrate? Sabrina said. We're getting close, Lieblings. When they send the goons, the bad guys are getting nervous. So, what now? Daphne asked. We'll follow these goons back to their hideout. What? Why would we do that? Sabrina cried, remembering Tony and his crowbar. Because they're going to lead us right back to their boss. Ladies, we're going on a stakeout. Mr. Canis managed to find the thugs' car in no time, and he trailed them at a distance, which had to be pretty great considering the noise coming from Mrs. Grimm's old rust bucket. Driving high into the hills overlooking Ferryport Landing, they passed no other cars, just a few deer wandering by the road in the fading light. But Sabrina wasn't enjoying the scenery. She was a nervous wreck. She had already worried about Mrs. Grimm's sanity based on the ridiculous fairy tale story she had told earlier that day. Now the crazy old woman had them chasing 3 dangerous men. She wanted to kick herself for not escaping when they had the chance, and decided that she and Daphne would make a run for it as soon as possible. Eventually, the thug's car pulled into the empty driveway of a small mountain cabin. Mr. Canis turned the engine and lights off and let the car coast along the road until they found a dense growth of trees to park behind. When they came to a stop, Mrs. Grimm opened up her handbag, fumbled through it, and took out a pair of odd-looking binoculars. What are those? Daphne asked. They're binoculars for nighttime. They're called infrared goggles. I thought they might come in handy tonight, the old woman said as she handed them to Daphne. Want to take a peek? Daphne took the goggles and raised them to her eyes. Ugh, that's horrible! Sabrina looked out the window and saw nothing. What? What do you see? She asked nervously. You! The little girl giggled. Here, take a look. The older girl stuck out her tongue and took the goggles from her sister. When she looked through them, the darkness became illuminated in green light, and she saw that the 3 thugs going into the cabin. "Let's see who else turns up," Mrs. Grimm said. "Sabrina, would you mind letting Elvis out? He probably needs to stretch his legs." Sabrina handed Mrs. Grimm the goggles and opened the door. Elvis lumbered out, causing the car to make noises that sounded like squeals of delight. With the door open, the girls could have easily made a break for it, using the woods for cover as they made their escape, but Daphne was leaning on the front seat asking questions. "Granny Relda, are all the fairy tales true?" "Almost all of them, but some are just bedtime stories to get kids to go to sleep. For instance, a dish never ran away with a spoon, and no cow that I ever know of has ever jumped over the moon." "How about the 3 little pigs?" Mr. Canis shifted in his seat but said nothing. "Yes, dear, they are real," Mrs. Grimm replied. "How about Snow White?" "Yes, indeed. In fact, she's a teacher at Fairyport Landing Elementary. We're going to have to enroll you 2 there in a couple of weeks. She's very sweet and, as you know, very good with little people like yourself." "What about Santa Claus?" "I've never met him, but I have it on good faith that he is alive and well." "I've got a question for you," Sabrina said. "These stories were written hundreds of years ago. How could all of these people still be alive?" "Easy, child, it's magic," Mrs. Grimm explained. "Duh," Daphne said to her sister, as if it were common knowledge. Sabrina shot her an angry look, but the little girl ignored it. "Granny Relda, have you ever seen a giant?" Daphne asked. "Of course, Liebling. I've even been to the Giant Kingdom on a couple of occasions. The last time I was nearly squished by the Giant Queen's toe," Mrs. Grimm laughed. "As an apology, she gave me that piece of fabric." "Well, if there really are giants, how come we haven't seen any yet?" Daphne asked. "There weren't any around until yesterday," Mrs. Grimm said. "Long ago, the ever-afters realized that giants were just too unpredictable. They caused as much destruction when they were happy as they did when they were mad, and once they planted themselves somewhere, it was impossible to get them to move. Imagine trying to plant seeds on your farm with a sleepy giant lying across it. When humans started moving into Fairyport Landing, everyone realized that the giants were just too big to disguise. Of course, the giants didn't agree and refused to go back to their kingdom. Your great-uncle Edwin and your great-aunt Matilda tricked them into climbing their beanstalks, and once they were all up there, the townsfolk chopped the beanstalks down." "What good would that do?" Daphne asked. "No beanstalk, no way into our world. Of course, there were a couple of people who didn't much care for the plan. In old days, people would plant magic beans and climb up the beanstalks just to steal the giants' treasures. Lots of people were foolish enough to try, but only one ever survived the ordeal," Mrs. Grimm said. "Jack?" Daphne asked. "You are correct, Liebling. Jack robbed many giants and killed quite a number of them, too. In his day, he was very rich and famous, though I hear he's working at a big and tall clothing store downtown. I can't imagine he'd be too happy doing that." "Are you going to sit here and tell us that Jack was a real person?" Sabrina snapped. "Was and is, my love," Mrs. Grimm replied. "So, let's just say all this is true. If all the beanstalks were destroyed, how did a giant get down here?" Sabrina asked, confident that she had tripped up the old woman. "Ah, Liebling, that is indeed the mystery that we are trying to solve. Whoever did it had to have a magic bean, and I thought we had accounted for all of them. It would help if we knew why they wanted to let a giant loose." "I'll bet he was a big one, Granny Relda. Probably 1,000 feet high," Daphne exclaimed. "Oh, sweetheart, he's probably no bigger than 200 feet tall," Mrs. Grimm said. Sabrina looked down at her little sister in the moonlight and frowned. Daphne's eyes were as big as frisbees. Sabrina was losing her little sister to the old lunatic. For a year and a half, it had just been the 2 of them, and Sabrina had done everything she could to keep them together and safe. She had protected her sister from nasty Mrs. Smirt, the horrible kids in the orphanage, and all those foster parents, and now she was unable to protect her from a crazy old woman. Just then, Elvis let out a low growl. "Someone's coming," Mrs. Grimm warned as headlights flashed behind them. "Everyone get down." They all huddled under the windows as a car passed and headed towards the cabin. When it was far enough away, they lifted their heads. "I don't think he saw us," Daphne said. The old woman lifted the goggles to her eyes. "Well, Sabrina, we've got more evidence for your theory. That's Mayor Charming's car," Mrs. Grimm said. "I didn't expect to see him here." Mr. Canis rolled his window down and sniffed the cool mountain air. Then, as if he had smelled something foul, his nose curled up. The odd thing was that Elvis, who was sitting outside of Mr. Canis's window, had the same expression. The two of them were smelling something they didn't like. "Charming is knocking on the door," Mrs. Grimm reported. Mr. Canis turned his seat. "Child, open your door. The dog should get back into the car." Daphne opened her door and called for Elvis, but the Great Dane stood motionless, sniffing the air as if he was dedicating all his attention to it. "They're talking," the old woman continued, still looking through her goggles. "Get into the car, dog," Mr. Canis called sternly. Elvis turned to face him, but kept sniffing. "Wait a minute. Charming is running to his car. Something's got him spooked," Mrs. Grimm remarked. "And you won't believe who's with him." It was the perfect opportunity. The old woman was watching the house, and Mr. Canis was distracted by Elvis. Sabrina grabbed her sister's hand, opened her car door, and pulled Daphne out. "What are you doing?" Daphne cried. "We're getting out of here this minute," Sabrina replied, but before they could even take a step, Elvis blocked their escape with his huge body. "Come on, you big flea hotel, get out of the way," Sabrina shouted, but the dog refused to budge. "Don't call him a flea hotel," Daphne scolded. "He's sensitive." Elvis let out a horrible whine. It was followed by an earth-shaking thump that sent the girls tumbling to the ground. "What was that?" Sabrina asked, trying to stand up. "Girls, get in the car," Mr. Canis urged. His face looked serious and dark. "We're not going anywhere with you," Sabrina cried as she got to her feet. "Lieblings, please, something is coming," Mrs. Grimm begged. "Something is coming? What does that mean? Enough with your stories, okay?" Sabrina yelled. "You're just trying to scare us and give my sister nightmares so that maybe we'll be too frightened to leave you." It was almost as if the mini earthquake had knocked something loose inside of Sabrina, an anger and a frustration at being abandoned, drifting from foster home to foster home, always hoping for some place where they could be happy, but finding that wherever they got close, it was tainted with some sort of craziness. "Sabrina, we can discuss this at another time. Please, get in the car," Mrs. Grimm pleaded once more. "I don't want to hear another word about fairies and goblins and giants or Jack and the Beanstalk or Humpty Dumpty," Sabrina raged as Elvis let out a shrieking howl. "I know the difference between reality and a fairy tale." But she had hardly finished her rant when something fell out of the sky. It was monstrous and encircled the car and lifted it off the ground. Sabrina couldn't believe what she was seeing, but it was there, right in front of her. It was a hand, a giant hand. Her eyes traveled up the arm higher and higher until she found a giant head, and then immediately wished she hadn't. Boils as thick as birthday cakes pocked the giant's greasy skin. A broken nose zigzagged across his face, and one dead white eye seeped pus, while the other one was lined with the crust of sleep. Hairs as thick as tree trunks jutted out of his nose and hung over a mouthful of broken, misplaced yellow and green teeth. He wore the hides of dozens of gigantic animals, including the head of what looked like a giant bear for a helmet. The dead bear's sharp fangs dug into his bald head, threatening to pierce his brain. His boots were made from more hides, and tangled in the laces were several unfortunate saplings. The giant lifted the car to his repugnant face and looked inside like a child inspecting a toy. With his free hand, he picked his nose. "Where is Englishman?" he bellowed. "Why does he hide from me?" Sabrina couldn't see what was going on in the car as it was nearly 200 feet off the ground. Were Mrs. Grimm and Mr. Canis even still alive? It was all so horrible that the two girls barely noticed that something had dropped from the car, landing with a clang at their feet. "You cannot hide from me, Englishman!" the giant shouted as he lifted his enormous leg and stomped down hard on the little mountain cabin, flattening it like a pancake. Pieces of timber and stones sprayed into the air, just missing the girls. Sabrina and Daphne gasped. The three thugs, Tony, Steve, and Bobby, had been inside the cabin. There was no way any of them could have escaped. Looking down at the destruction, the giant let out a sickening laugh. He stuffed the car into a greasy shirt pocket, lifted his other humongous leg and walked away, carrying the remains of the mountain cabin in the treads of his boots. The earth shook violently and a ripple spilled across the land as if someone had tossed a stone into a pond and let it skip. Because of his mammoth stride, the giant completely disappeared over the horizon just a dozen steps. Only the distant rumbling of his disastrous footfalls and the angry growls of Elvis remained. The girls stood completely frozen. Competing with Sabrina's fear was another unsettling emotion: humiliation. Mrs. Grimm had been telling the truth the whole time, and Sabrina had refused to listen. Sabrina had deliberately been a jerk to the old woman, and now she might never see her again to tell her that she was sorry. She moved to comfort her sister, but Daphne pulled away. The little girl rushed to pick up whatever had fallen from the car. It was Mrs. Grimm's handbag. "She was telling the truth, and you have been a big snot since the first minute. Tell me now if you think she's crazy," Daphne said furiously. "I don't think she's crazy," her older sister said, but Daphne had already turned and was marching down the road. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to rescue our family," the little girl called without stopping. All right, friends, that is it for today. Join us tomorrow for Chapter 5, and we'll see if we can find Mrs. Grimm and Mr. Canis and where the giant went off to. All right, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.